Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Biosimilars, Key Learnings and Opportunities for Greater U.S. Adoption. On behalf of Becker's Healthcare, thank you for joining us. So before we begin, I'm going to walk through just a few quick housekeeping instructions. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation and a panel discussion, and we'll have time at the end for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. If at any time you don't see the video slides moving or have trouble with the audio, try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We're here to help. So with that, we're excited to dive into our webinar covering 3 key learnings. So the first is why Kaiser Permanente chose to adopt biosimilars, how they did so successfully, and the positive outcomes of implementation. The second is policy considerations impacting the general U.S. biosimilar landscape and the roadblocks and opportunities to greater biosimilar adoption. And the third is how to sustain biosimilar momentum in the U.S. to deliver increased value to patients and the healthcare system as a whole. Our esteemed panel here is Dr. Samir Afsari, Associate Executive Director, the Permanente Medical Group, Kaiser Permanente; Christine Simon, Executive Director, Biosimilars Council and Senior Vice President, Policy and Strategic Alliances, Association for Accessible Medicines; and Len Arsenault, Vice President, Policy, Medical and External Engagement, Sandoz Inc. So before we jump in and hear from our panel, I'd like to share some quick background on biosimilars. So first off, biosimilars are FDA-approved medicines that went through a rigorous testing process and are subject to the same quality manufacturing standards that are applied to the reference medicine in terms of safety, efficacy, and quality. Confirmatory clinical studies have repeatedly shown that there is no clinically meaningful difference in terms of safety, purity, and potency between biosimilars and their reference medicines. Why we are talking about them today? Biosimilars have positive impacts for both hospital systems and for patients. Cost savings from biosimilar medicines can be used to treat more patients and have the potential to save the U.S. healthcare system $54 billion over 10 years. So with that, I'll now turn the floor over to Dr. Afsari.
Thank you, Brian. So for those of you who are not familiar with Kaiser Permanente, I'll take a quick moment to let you know who we are. We're an integrated delivery system that takes care of 12.4 million patients across 8 states in the District of Columbia. As you can see, we have numerous medical offices, hospitals, 23,000 physicians and 63,000 nurses. Operating revenues in 2020 were $84 billion, and our pharmacy expense was $13 billion. And as Brian mentioned, there is a tremendous opportunity with a whole bunch of patent expirations in 2023 for biosimilars and for our nation to save some money. So I've been talking about biosimilars for about 3 or 4 years now, and when I started, the uptake of biosimilars in the United States was about 3%, and I remember reading in the Wall Street Journal an article about whether it was time to throw in the towel on biosimilars. But as you can see, utilization rates in 2020 are starting to get better. So with filgrastim, we're almost at 72% use of biosimilars. But we continue to have opportunity to do even better across the nation. So I want to talk to you a little bit about our approach at Kaiser Permanente with biosimilars and how we have been able to successfully use them. And it really starts with the evidence and looking at the evidence through the eyes of the clinicians. So the physicians and pharmacists taking a look at the evidence, whether it's from the US or from the rest of the world, and agreeing upon using the product. And after that, we go to contracting and say, hey, go get a good rate, which is quite different from many other health plans, which start with a contract and then try to get the clinicians to use the product. So getting the right people to endorse ahead really makes a big difference. And then we engage with the right specialists before it comes to the formulary. So if it's a drug that affects neurology, then our chiefs of neurology review that. If it's an oncologic drug, then the oncologists review that. So by the time it comes to our formulary committee, which is actually 44 people in Northern California across a lot of specialties, it really has been vetted by the appropriate clinicians, and then it usually gets approved. After that, we found that education was a tremendous piece that we needed to work on. Not only was it education for the pharmacists, the physicians, the nurses who actually infused it, but our patients as well. Until about 2019, there really were no education materials for patients, and we had to produce our own. And we're really delighted that the FDA finally put out some good education materials, not only for patients, but for physicians as well. And then we make it easy for physicians to do the right thing and to order the correct medications by putting them in the electronic medical record. And then the last thing that has really worked well is to track the utilization, re-educate people if they needed education on biosimilars. And of course, people want to make sure that these new biosimilars were safe. So we have a pharmacy research division that monitors our patients who are on there so that we know that they're having safe outcomes and they're continuing to do well. The other area that we're very successful is that we can really move market share. So although we only have 12.2 million patients in the United States, that's 4% of covered lives. Once we make a decision to use a biosimilar, we can move that market share to that biosimilar product. And this is something that is really important. I think education was absolutely pivotal, and you can see some of the questions that not only our physicians, but our patients have as well. So they want to know if the biosimilar is just as effective. And Brian just said, yes, they are. Are they just as safe? And yes, they are. Are the presentations the same? Is there a difference in patient convenience? And in patients' minds, is this more cost effective? And again, on the last slide, I did mention that we have a lot of efforts in pharmacovigilance, which is taking a look at how our patients are doing once they're on these biosimilars, and also publishing that data. So this is our experience with biosimilars. And if you look to the right of the screen, I'm showing an example of one, which was the first biosimilar that was available to us. Initially, we used to have Neupogen, and once the biosimilar Zarzio came out, you can see we had a tremendous uptake, and now 95% or higher of our patients are on Zarzio. And if you look below, that's a slide that makes me feel really good, because when Zarzio first came out, Kaiser Permanente, which takes care of 4% of the country's patients, was using 69% of that biosimilar. And as you can see, by 2021, the rest of the country is catching up, which means that biosimilar uptake is going up across the nation. So in Kaiser Permanente, we've used biosimilars to treat patients who are treatment naive, as well as patients who are already on the reference biologic. I have to add that most patients are very satisfied with the switch to the biosimilar, and they always have the option to switch back if things are not working well. And today, I'm very proud to say that our biosimilar utilization rate in Kaiser Permanente is 82 to 95% compared to the reference biologic. And over the last few years, our estimated savings are about $200 million. So I think our Kaiser Permanente biosimilar strategy is very simple, and it's similar to what we did with generics. We want to provide high quality, affordable care to our patients, and both generics and biosimilars are a key component. Biosimilars offer exactly the same efficacy and safety as the originator product, and they do provide reduced costs not only to our patients, but to our program. And Kaiser Permanente is very proud to be a leader in the U.S. biosimilar market, and we continue to strive to promote these products so that more biosimilars can come on the market. And with that, I'll thank everyone and switch it back to you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asari. I want to make sure we move to Christine next. But first, I want to ask you, what has the biggest aha moment been for patients and prescribers that makes them truly sort of, understand and begin to trust biosimilars?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. And the biggest aha moment for physicians and patients was that there was really no difference in efficacy or outcomes. So if someone was on the originator product and they switched to a biosimilar and their condition was continued to be well controlled, that was really important to our patients. And that was really important to our physicians as well. And the other aha moment we had was actually giving people the time. So we did not just randomly switch people to the biosimilar. We actually provided time to our physicians so that they could have conversations with their patients as to why we were doing that and how we were going to do it and what would happen if it didn't work.
Yeah, so it's really the efficacy and just making sure you have that time to communicate face to face, right, and build that trust.
That's right.
Excellent. Then before we move forward, I do want to ask, how did Kaiser Permanente reinvest that $200 million? What did you guys do with that?
Yeah, so we didn't put into more biosimilars. As you know, that high cost of drugs is on the minds of our population. And it's tragic that in this country, almost 25% of people cannot afford their prescription drugs. And as you know, every year, lots of blockbuster drugs come out, which are extremely expensive. So the savings from biosimilars allows us to continue to have access to all of these new medications that are coming out for our patients.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer there, Dr. Asari, and your quick overview there. Appreciate it. Christine, I want to keep us on time here, so let's turn the floor over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Brian, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here. I think it's an exciting time for biosimilars, and I think that we saw in Dr. Asari's presentation a lot of positive news and positive developments. But there still are some challenges, and I'm going to talk about some of those shortly. And, I think that it's hard to imagine that it's been 6 years since we at the Association for Accessible Medicines, which represents generic and biosimilar manufacturers, established the council to work with policymakers at the state and federal level and, make it so that patients can get better access and savings from biosimilars. So we're excited about that. And you see here on this slide, just sort of a brief overview of our organization. But if we move to the next slide, I want to, kind of quickly set the stage. And one of the upsides of a Zoom conference is that you can see the small print. So while the US continues to play catch up to the EU, since 2015, the FDA has approved 29 biosimilars, and 20 of these are now on the market. So while there has been real progress, it is, as you can see from this slide, concentrated mainly around oncology and increasingly in the autoimmune space. But that leaves many therapeutic areas where patients are still waiting. Yet more and more biosimilars certainly are in the queue at the FDA, and they will be approved. This is a good thing. Some of you may have seen the CVS drug trend report that was released, I think just last week. And it shows that specialty drugs, most of which are biologics, accounted for 52% of the drug spend in 2020. So that's a tremendous amount of money being spent on really fantastic medicines, and that's great, but we do want to introduce more competition into the system for patients. So I think, as you see in this slide, while there's a lot of savings and competition and treatment on the horizon, and the question really is, will these treatments become more readily available to patients? Right now, biosimilar volume is trailing the share of the market where they're competing head-to-head with biologic or innovator products is less than 20%. It's improving, and there's a good story to tell there, but there's still a tremendous amount of runway. So I really want to focus the discussion in this part of the session on some of the areas that are impacting patient uptake and utilization of biosimilars. And a lot of these are around incentives that are embedded in current federal policies that are not aligned with the goal of increasing biosimilars adoption, a goal that I think most policymakers do indeed share. And we have heard this, in the prior administrations, in the current administration, many policymakers in both the federal and state arenas certainly purport to want to increase biosimilar competition. And they're saying that partly at least to be responsive to their constituents. The high cost of prescription medicines is something that poll after poll after poll shows that the American public is extremely concerned about. And so policymakers are right to want to look for solutions. And we think there are solutions, certainly in federal programs, in Medicare Part B and Part D, where we can align our drug coverage and payment systems to support biosimilar adoption. So this means updating Medicare Part B to reward providers when they use lower cost biosimilars. And it means modernizing Medicare Part D to encourage health plans and PBMs to prefer lower cost biosimilars, because in 2023, we are going to see competitors to the innovator for a certain well-known blockbuster medicine that treats RA and psoriasis and other important conditions. And so, what we really want to do is make sure that we are reaching more patients. And fortunately, a number of legislative proposals have been introduced that would address these challenges. And we're hopeful that Congress will make progress on them this year. And I'll be speaking to them in more detail on the subsequent slides. But in addition, I'm sorry, can we just go back real quickly? In addition to those issues I mentioned in the Medicare space, there are other chronic issues such as abusive patenting and the need for more education. And in some cases, that education is to combat misinformation. So these too can be addressed through policy improvements. So I'm going to take a brief detour here to say a word on a recent IQVIA report that the Biosimilars Council commissioned. And there's a link to it at the bottom of the slide. Spoiler alert, reimbursement matters to physicians, as it turns out. And what this IQVIA report on biosimilars in the US reimbursement and impacts to uptake revealed is that when you look at different settings of care, hospital outpatient departments, which typically receive higher overall payments than physician offices, are less likely to adopt biosimilars. And that is driven in part by the higher relative reimbursement ratio they get for reference products. And meanwhile, though, in contrast, physicians participating in shared savings models that better align reimbursement and care, like the oncology care model framework, they are more likely to adopt biosimilars than other physicians. So that sort of level sets one of the opportunities for adoption that I want to discuss in greater detail, which means I'm really going to start in the middle here, because the one that most directly addresses physician reimbursement is increasing the add-on that physicians receive when they prescribe or utilize biosimilars. So this would increase by a couple of percentage points the average sales price reimbursement to ASP plus 8. And this is in a bill that has been introduced, a bipartisan bill called the Biosim Act, that is in pretty good standing when you think about the way that bills are moving through Congress at this time and in this particular legislative session. This is probably something that, is something that could move. It has been considered by the Health Subcommittee of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and it was included in one of the larger vehicles moving through Congress, and the Congressional Budget Office has had the opportunity to take a look at it. So that's a piece of legislation that we at the Council support, and we are hopeful will make a difference. And then going back to the first item listed here, this shared savings program is an opportunity to encourage physician use of biosimilars as well, but through a different vehicle. This would be a model program under which physicians would continue to get paid at the current Part B payment rate, But when the biosimilar has a lower price than the reference product, doctors could get part of the savings for choosing to administer the biosimilar. And this would be voluntary for participation for manufacturers, and it would be something that the physician would gain from and the system would gain from. So that's another opportunity. And then also you see that there is a bill moving through Congress to modernize Part D. We know that Part D, when it was first enacted in 2006, certainly didn't anticipate biosimilars. So this is really an updating to add the opportunity for a dedicated specialty tier to the Medicare Part D formulary, so that, benefit design, so that plans are encouraged to use biosimilars. And if we go to the next slide, which is really my last slide, we'll talk about just another couple of bills out there, initiatives to address some of the other barriers to biosimilars adoption. We've talked about the importance of education. I think that that's just something that will always be present, the need for education about biosimilars. And I'll just take a minute to note that the council was involved, and I think many folks as well on this presentation, but also out in the audience, were involved in Global Biosimilars Week, which was an initiative that ran in November of 2020, and it had an amazing reach across the globe. Almost 1 million impressions globally of different messages, educational messages on biosimilars. So this is the kind of digital effort and social media effort that really gains a lot of ground and creates sort of a following to get the message out. There were actually, when this program ran, 1,700 different Twitter posts and LinkedIn posts from 84 different countries. So imagine 84 different countries, people sharing and retweeting these great messages about the safety and efficacy of biosimilars, certainly helping to advance education. So that's something that is being done in the social media arena, but also to have legislation that helps the FDA continue its efforts to educate consumers and healthcare providers is something that we support. And then finally, I'll just say a quick word about patent abuse, which is a very big problem for biosimilars, a very big challenge and a thorny one, which is an apt description because we do refer to some of the abusive practices as patent thicketing. And that's when some brand name pharmaceutical companies accumulate many patents, dozens and dozens, near the end of the product life cycle under the guise of innovation. And in many cases, these late stage patents really are not reflecting changes made to the manufacturing process or to the product. And this is really intended to prolong monopoly pricing opportunities. And these patent thickets do chill competition. They discourage biosimilar competitors from entering a market because it costs so much to litigate these patents. We did a study back in 2019, and it showed that there was $7.6 billion in lost savings over the prior years due to patent thickets. So we're excited that there is legislation introduced that would stop this practice. So I think with that, I just want to note that there are some challenges to biosimilars, but they're not insurmountable. What we need to do is just put in the right policies that support market incentives and discourage bad behavior. And hopefully with those efforts, we'll get more biosimilars to more patients. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. You really did a wonderful job at laying out all that potential legislation there. I'm wondering, but I want to turn the floor over to Len here, but quickly, could you say maybe which policies you're the most optimistic about? Where do you think which policy is going to have the greatest impact? Is it that Medicare modernization? Is it the provider incentives? I wonder what's your quick take on that?
It's a combination of factors. because we have to look at which of these pieces of legislation is most likely to be enacted. Certainly the ones that aren't enacted won't have any impact. But then again, some of the proposals have more impact than others. So, shared savings has a tremendous potential impact. We've done some modeling around that with the help of a consulting firm, and shared savings could increase biosimilar adoption by 10 to 30%. Which is a great amount, over time, and maybe even as much as 80% by 2029. And in so doing, it has the potential to lower spending by, billions and billions of dollars for both the government and for patients. But as I mentioned, the Biosim Act to increase the payment for physicians is the one that is most likely to actually move through Congress. In that way, it would have the most impact by becoming real and increasing the amount of payment for physicians, and hopefully having sort of a domino effect. Because I wouldn't want to suggest that physicians are motivated only by finances. That's obviously not true. They're motivated by patient care first and foremost. And so, as they become more familiar with and use more biosimilars and see the patient results and improved access, that will have a cascading effect on biosimilars uptake.
Thank you, Christine. A lot of potential progress there. Appreciate you sharing that with our attendees. Len, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Brian. All right, so I'll be speaking about how we maintain the momentum and support the sustainability of biosimilars in the U.S. healthcare system. So, as we're all aware, the current trajectory of U.S. healthcare spending is unsustainable in the U.S. In 2019, healthcare expenditures were nearly 18% of the U.S. GDP. And biological medicines, while highly effective medicines, are a significant source of healthcare expenditures. In a report that was published late last year, IQVIA estimated that biologic medicines represent about 43% of the invoice level spending in the U.S. Spending on these important medicines has risen dramatically, as shown in the chart, we see a CAGR of, reported by IQVIA, about 14.6% compared to approximately 6% for the overall pharmaceutical market as a whole. So here we see that biosimilars offer a significant solution to the rising cost of healthcare, particularly for the biological medicines that I mentioned before. Since the first the biosimilar Zarzio was introduced that Dr. Osari was talking about earlier, the pace of biosimilar approvals has accelerated in the US. However, cost savings from biosimilars have not kept pace with approvals. FDA approvals of a biosimilar don't translate directly into cost savings. The savings realized in biosimilars depend on many factors. The graph on the right shows that by 2024, the annual savings from biosimilars are projected to be in the range anywhere from about $20 billion to high of $50 billion, with the total aggregate savings in 5 years exceeding $100 billion potentially. Now, the magnitude of these savings will eventually be realized depends on several factors, but public policy, as Christine spoke to, really is one of the key components, as well as prescriber and patient confidence, and a fair and competitive biological marketplace. The next slide speaks to the potential lost savings that we see in the US. So you can see, despite the savings potential, we've not been fully successful in realizing the potential savings in the US. And it's estimated that in the last 2 years, the US has lost more than $24 billion in potential savings because of biosimilars that have not been used that potentially could have. At the same time, US patients have forgone about $280 million in potential out-of-pocket savings. However, we have had some significant successes, and we've certainly seen with the launch of the recent oncology biosimilars for trastuzumab, bevacizumab, and rituximab, that there's been significant increases in the overall uptake of biosimilars. Biosimilars create cost savings not just because they're available at a lower price, they also introduce previously unseen competitive pressures in the biologic marketplace. You can see on these slides that with the introduction of both biosimilars for filgrastim and pegfilgrastim, this was associated with decreases in the overall net price of the reference product. And as Dr. Osari also discussed earlier, Kaiser Permanente saved more than $200 million since 2015 by adopting biosimilars and reinvested these savings to improve patient access and care. This is a proof that biosimilars can provide true value. But despite these successes, there's still some obstacles. I think Christine spoke very eloquently of some of the suboptimal policies that that we're all working at having rectified, and misinformation campaigns still do exist, as does in some cases absence of education in the way of biosimilars, and there are measures that are in place to try to correct for that, as Christine also outlined in her presentation. So how do we address the hurdles and accelerate biosimilar adoption? First, we need to broaden the awareness of and benefits of biosimilar by communicating real-world US examples. Success stories like Dr. Osari at Kaiser Permanente and other examples, such as savings realized by Robert Wood Johnson Barnabas healthcare systems, can inspire and motivate other healthcare systems to do the work and create the framework to accelerate biosimilar adoption in their organizations and realize their potential savings locally. Second, supportive policies. And Christine, I think, outlined that beautifully earlier. These need to be adapted to mitigate the roadblocks that she outlined as well. And finally, we need to enhance the education and combat misinformation. Biosimilar disparagement has been recognized as a serious concern by both the FDA and the Federal Trade Commission. To support development of a competitive marketplace for biologics, the FDA issued a Biosimilars Action Plan in July of 2018, and as part of this effort, the FDA and FTC hosted a joint public workshop in March of 2020. At Sandoz, we're proud to support these efforts and ensure a competitive marketplace for biologics. Sandoz is committed to working with all of you here today to identify opportunities to ensure that biosimilars are available, affordable, and accessible, and that payers, patients, and HCPs recognize their value as an acceptable alternative to the higher cost originator medicines. Realizing the full potential of biosimilars ensures that we're on the right path to having a sustainable healthcare system. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Len. You mentioned in your presentation sort of some of this hesitation and the importance of, sharing success stories like those of Kaiser Permanente. Can you talk a bit more about that? How can stakeholders really address this issue around hesitation?
Well, I think we all have a role to play. That's one of the reasons that we're here today, right? It's about having the conversations, making all stakeholders aware of what some of the challenges are, and working collectively to try to solve some of those problems and bring solutions to the table. So I think these kind of dialogues are really important. Also, bringing the FDA into the equation as well. The FDA, I think, has an important role to play as a trusted healthcare authority to dispel some of the disparagement comments that are made out that we see in the public domain. So we all have a role to play, but I think it's important that we tackle the hurdles that exist from a policy perspective that Christine spoke to, and that we all, engage and do our part to make sure that some of those barriers are brought down.
Exactly. It's why we're here, right? It's why we're having this kind of conversation. Exactly. Okay. I want to move to some questions for the group before we get to some audience questions. Just we might be a little tight on time, but I want to get to a couple of these. So first one for this great group here, what do you anticipate or hope for in the next 5 to 10 years? How do you think the industry will transform? What do you want to see? Can we talk more about that? I'll just open that up.
Well, I would want to see greater patient access and expansion into more therapeutic areas for biosimilars, and policies in place that will ensure the sustainability of biosimilar industry. The biosimilars industry needs to know that there will be a market and that the very substantial investments that manufacturers need to make to produce biosimilars, to get regulatory approval, that those investments will pay off in the sense of being able to sustainably make these patients available, make these products available to patients. And that is a key factor I think we have to talk about, in the larger dialogue. Is it's more than just getting the biosimilar through the FDA. It's more than just getting the biosimilar through the patent thicket. It's more than getting the biosimilar onto the formularies and into the hands of patients. It's also about making that process sustainable.
I would absolutely agree with what Christine said, because as a physician, what do you want? You want your patient to be able to get the medication that is life-changing for them and for them to get better. I mean, that's really what we want. And if we can't get these biosimilars to market and in the hands of patients and physicians to administer them, we can't get people better. And that's what I would really like to see over the next 5 years, these medicines really accessible to our patients.
I agree with everything that's been said, and I think it's important that we see in the next 5 years the realization of the potential of biosimilars, what they really can do. The commitment on the part of companies like ours that get involved in biosimilars, Christine alluded to it, but it really is quite significant. Each one of these products, typically we're talking about investments of $150 to $250 million per product. There's companies like ours that have 15 or so of those products in development at a given time. That's a significant investment. And we see the hurdles that the US represents, but yet we're determined to make it happen because it's such a promise to bring these products to American patients. So in the next 5 years, I would like to see some of these barriers lifted so that we can start to see some of these biosimilars make it to patients much more readily and contribute to the overall sustainability of the healthcare system, so the freed up monies can go towards new innovations as well.
Thank you, all three of you, for weighing in there. I do want to jump to audience questions, but first, I think it's important that we talk about how COVID-19 has potentially really impacted the production or adoption of biosimilars. So I'll open up that one for comment, and any other closing comments either of you might have, or either three of you might have, sort of before we move to audience questions. But how has COVID-19 impacted things here?
I think from a policy perspective, COVID-19, of course, has taken up a great deal of, as it should, time and energy of policymakers. And that is a big focus, continuing to respond and looking at issues like supply chain issues, where I must say I believe our biosimilars and generics industry performed very well during the pandemic. But so I think that's one issue. But I think one of the learnings from COVID and from the vaccine rollout is the importance of the messenger. And here I go back to the great work being done by Kaiser in terms of not just getting biosimilars to patients, but collecting the data and publishing the data, and really being a messenger in the healthcare sector for biosimilars. And we have on our website some new patient videos where we're hearing directly from patients who are taking biosimilars about their positive experiences. And that sort of peer-to-peer, patient-to-patient communication, I think, is the sort of thing that we've learned from COVID, and we're learning from the vaccine rollout, is very important to get education, sort of from a peer standpoint, to help encourage patients to try biosimilars and work with the providers to do that. So to me, that's one of the learnings.
I would say from the physician perspective, when the pandemic first hit and we had shelter in place, patients were actually scared to come in to take these medications because they were immunocompromised and they were wondering, if I come into the hospital or to a clinic or infusion center, am I going to actually get sick? So we actually saw people who had serious conditions who didn't come in for a while. But as things improved, and as people are getting vaccinated, we're seeing more and more of our patients coming back and actually taking their medications, which are really important.
I'd say from our side, the supply is always a challenge, but I think with our company in particular, there was a very good focus on having a resilient supply chain. So we weren't actually penalized. Our patients weren't penalized through COVID by taking in not being able to get our product. So that was certainly a blessing. Where I see some of the bigger differences is how we engage. So, for example, a session like this is maybe different than what we would have done pre-COVID. So how we engage with our patients, how we engage with our healthcare professionals, that has been transformative. And not, in many respects, we see some significant positives in there as well. So that the whole model of engagement and possibly how we see healthcare evolve will likely change as a result of COVID-19. So it's been quite a fascinating journey these last many months.
Most definitely. It's been a pleasure speaking with the three of you. Great stuff, and learned a lot, and I know our attendees appreciate it. So without any further delay, let's jump to some audience questions.
All right, so as a reminder for our attendees, you can submit any questions you have by typing them into the Q&A chat box on your webinar console. So let's get started with this one. The attendee asked, how has Kaiser Permanente been able to be so successful with biosimilar uptake? Dr. Asari, you want to get us going here?
Sure. Thanks, Brian. So our success has been multifactorial. It really helps that the clinicians and pharmacists look at the evidence and then agree to put the biosimilar on the formulary. So that's really easy to do. The most important part is really education of our patients, our physicians, our pharmacists, and even our nurses who actually infuse those biosimilars to make sure that they understand that these are safe and their efficacy is exactly the same. We also found that physician champions play a great role. So for instance, for infliximab, which has had a lower uptake in this country, we actually have a inflammatory bowel disease specialist, a researcher who's had a lot of experience. So him talking to our gastroenterology colleagues really helped. And then our physicians are salaried, so no perverse incentives of infusing something that is more expensive. And then the final reason that we do really well is research. We take a look and make sure that our patients are not having any issues on the biosimilars and share that data with our physicians. And now we're publishing it as well.
Thank you so much for tackling that one, Dr. Asari. So then the next question here, let me pull it up. This attendee asked, how do you think interchangeability designation might impact the adoption of biosimilars? Len, do you want to kick us off on that one?
Thanks, Brian. This is probably one that I think all of us could weigh in on. And part of it is that it's a bit elusive right now. Interchangeability is very much a U.S. specific phenomenon, the way that it's been defined by the FDA. This designation doesn't exist in other countries, and we see significant uptake in regions like Europe, in Canada, for example, where interchangeability is really defined quite differently by the provinces and isn't even touched by Health Canada, for example. But in the U.S., it's quite specific, and it has been designated by the BPCIA. The challenge is that there hasn't been an interchangeable biosimilar that's been, or no biosimilar has yet been awarded that designation. So it remains to be seen. We see many of the states, if not close to all of the states, have now passed legislation that allows access for biosimilars that have received that designation. So there does appear to be some promise down the road should that designation happen. But we have yet to see it, as I mentioned. So the hurdles are quite high as well. So the FDA have put out a guidance document in 2019 that lays out one pathway to interchangeability, and some companies have made attempts to try to get there, but it remains to be seen. I think It's in a way a bit unfortunate that we have this challenge, specifically in the US with this designation of interchangeability. Because as I'm saying, in other regions, we see that biosimilars actually have very significant market uptakes without the existence of that designation. So I think it leads to the question as to whether it really is necessary.
Thank you, Len.
I can just jump in.
Comments. Go ahead, Christine.
Oh, sorry, Brian. I was just going to jump in and add another perspective similar. You know, certainly I think that the guidance from the FDA has been helpful, you know, in terms of streamlined data and study design requirements that do allow some flexibility, and the use of global comparator products to support some applications. But you know, I do think it's important to understand, and this is another aspect of the education that is so critical to biosimilars writ large for patients and providers, is that the interchangeability designation, which, as Len points out, is unique to the United States, it does not confer any additional quality or safety attributes for FDA-approved biosimilars. And so, you know, it is great if a manufacturer wishes to pursue interchangeability, but the lack of that designation, or a manufacturer does not choose to pursue that designation from the FDA, does not indicate any difference in safety or quality. And that's very important. I think, you know, to some degree, if payers and providers and patients are waiting for interchangeability to really trust biosimilars, then that will be a missed opportunity, because we know that the 29 FDA-approved biosimilars are just as safe and effective as their reference biologics. And that's just the key point, I think, that everyone should be focused on.
Yeah, Brian, I would agree with Christine that the interchangeability designation is frankly very confusing, and it actually confuses our patients. So unlike generics, you know, which are identical chemicals, biologics are made from cell lines, so they'll never be identical. But their effect and their safety and actually making patients better is identical. And so I think probably the U.S. should consider not having this interchangeability designation, which no other place in the world really has. And that'll actually stop a lot of the misinformation campaigns.
Well, thank you so much, all three of you, for weighing in there. I just want to note for our attendees that we will be distributing slides via email. So I've seen a few questions come in about that, so just want to share some clarity with our attendees today. And then this next question, Christine, I'm gonna put to you. The attendee asked, outside of Medicare fee-for-service, many payers are expediting the adoption of biosimilars through policy. Do you see this happening widely across the country?
That's a great question. So I appreciate that coming in. And you know, there is some good news on that front as the education takes hold, as savings data continues to help convince payers to expedite the adoption of biosimilars. And, you know, we do get a lot of inquiries from payers and payer groups about biosimilar savings. And so that's, you know, data that we're happy to help share, and so that these payers can build into their planning the anticipation of reaping those savings. And I think that, you know, there are policies in place to encourage biosimilars uptake. This can be through benefit design, and this can even be through kind of smaller versions of gain sharing or shared savings that we've talked about on a macro policy level. Some payers are starting to roll out those kinds of programs. So I'm hopeful that it's something that's taking hold and will continue to take hold when biosimilars are coming into the marketplace at an average of 30% off the reference biologic price. And when we know biologics make up the vast majority of the pipeline for prescription medications and really are the future of medicine. I always say, if you're not on a biologic now, you will be someday. We all will. So I think that payers, can't ignore the statistics and the data that biosimilars are one of the most effective ways to drive savings for beneficiaries.
Brian, I would add that. Go ahead.
No, absolutely. You go. Sorry about that.
I was just going to add that if you asked me 3 years ago, I'd be very pessimistic because there are only 3 biosimilars on the market. But as Christine pointed out in her presentation today, the U.S. has 29 biosimilars with 9 reference products. And someone had asked in the chat, EU has 58 biosimilars with 16 reference products. But if you look at the first biosimilar that came out in the U.S., filgrastim, the biosimilar share of the market is 72%. So what I would say is Europe started a decade ahead of us. So their biosimilar child was actually finishing elementary school while we were still in the cradle here in the United States. So I think we have an opportunity to catch up and get faster than Europe.
Thank you so much for adding that, Dr. Asari. This next question, I think, serves as sort of a follow-up. So the attendee asked what sort of policies need to be adopted or amended on the state level to increase the uptake of biosimilars. Christine, do you want to kick us off here again?
Sure, happy to. And I think this is another great question because certainly, states have had to kind of adapt to the emergence of biosimilars and adjust some of their policies accordingly. And we've seen that with great success. Almost all of the 50 states now will allow for the substitution of biosimilars as they have for generics, and so that's fantastic. But we also sometimes see policies that are not, that have the unintended consequence of potentially discouraging biosimilar competition or utilization. And oftentimes these policies are well-intended, but it's a complex area, and state legislators who are dealing with, multiple issues, often in very short, harried sessions, and some state legislators, serve the public on a part-time basis only. So there's a lot of different considerations at the states. It's fast-paced and a lot going on, and so it's not too surprising that sometimes in an effort to actually help biosimilars uptake and patient access, when you get down to the details, there are unintended consequences. We're seeing this, for example, right now in Minnesota. And so I think that, the main point is to encourage competition, allow plans the flexibility to have a preference for biosimilars in order to help encourage their use and the use of lower cost medicines for the benefit of patients, and not to be overly prescriptive in terms of how biosimilars can be how plans can best utilize biosimilars and best present them to their beneficiaries, because we are seeing that that's an unfortunate development in some states right now.
Certainly a complicated issue there, Christine. I appreciate you wading through it with us. Len, the next question I'm going to throw your way. So the attendee asked, what are some of the greatest misperceptions about biosimilars you'd like to correct?
Well, I think that we already touched on interchangeability, so I'm not going to go there again. But I think that one of the challenges is just the different levels of safety, efficacy, and quality that come from policies such as interchangeability. Another challenge that we've experienced is with naming and the suffix that's specific in the U.S., where there's a 4-letter suffix put at the end of the international non-proprietary name that sometimes can be it causes confusion. But those are two that I would like to call out more specifically.
Thank you, Len. And we'll do one final question here before we sign off. Dr. Asari, this one's addressed to you. So the attendee says, we know there is inherent healthcare savings related to biosimilars, but how does Kaiser document patient savings on biosimilars? Is this a driver for patient acceptance?
No. So it's a good question. As I mentioned in my previous comments, we always start out by looking at the evidence. As a physician, you want to make sure whatever you give your patient is safe and is actually going to give them the best results. So when you start with that's an easy thing to do. But what we can do here in Kaiser Permanente is once we've decided on the product, we're able to get physicians to completely move that market share. So as you saw, our biosimilar adoption is 82% for infliximab, and then almost 95 to 96% for all of the other ones. So again, giving our physicians time to talk to their patients, because who do they trust? Patients and physicians have a great relationship, and honestly, hearing from your doctor really makes the biggest difference. And then giving patients choice to be able to switch back if the biosimilar wasn't working, has really led to the success of biosimilar uptake. So the savings actually has nothing to do with being the driver for patient acceptance. It's really a conversation between the patient and physician.
Thank you so much for addressing that, Dr. Asari. It looks like we do have a few more minutes left, so I'm going to ask this final question to all three of you. So the question is, what role do patients have in biosimilar adoption in the U.S.? Len, maybe we can hear from you first, then Christine and Dr. Asari.
Thanks, Brian. So I think that one of the things that patients can do is to educate themselves. We have lots of tools that are out there in terms of education on biosimilars. Be curious, ask questions, and work with patient organizations that can provide the information and education. I think another thing that they can do is if for example, they're working with a company, to work with employer groups to call for greater use for biosimilars. These are products that, as we've discussed, are highly efficacious. They're safe. They're as safe and efficacious as the reference biologic. And in the end, they will just lead to greater patient access. So patients I think, do have a role to play in terms of demanding that their plans, for example, include biosimilars and make those options open to them.
And I think Len's exactly right. I would just echo those statements. Patients, I think now more than ever, patients are learning to be their own best advocates in the healthcare system, and that's smart for the patient to do, especially if a patient is taking a biologic medicine, because those medicines do often require physician administration or administration in a clinical setting. And I think those patients are in a good position to know more about their medication and to work with their provider to ensure that they are receiving the most cost-effective medication that, of course, is FDA approved and as safe and effective as the reference biologic in being a biosimilar. So that, and then I think I would encourage patients to share their stories, because that is how education grows and spreads, and how confidence builds. And any patient who is interested in sharing their story certainly can contact the Association for Accessible Medicines and our Biosimilars Council, because we do have a mechanism for doing that. But I do think that kind of peer-to-peer education is extremely helpful.
I'll agree with what Len and Christine have said. It's important for patients to ask their physician if a biosimilar is available. some of our patients with cancers are not on one biologic, but 2 or 3, and that can be a significant cost to the patient. And what use are these life-changing medications if we can't afford it? Because after all, we want our patients to get better and our country to be healthier.
Great final sentiment to end on there. So thank you so much, Dr. Asari, Christine, and Len, for a great conversation and their excellent presentations. I also want to thank Sandoz for sponsoring today's webinar. To learn more about the content presented today, please check out the resources section on your webinar console and fill out the post-webinar survey. Thank you for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon.